Thank you, Evan. It's a hard act to follow, but I'll try my best here. We'll just take a second here. As Evan mentioned, my name is Matthew Freilich. I'm the head of the network funding team here at Protocol Labs, and I want to talk to you about funding networks, which is probably a more simplistic title than I would have liked, but we're going for simplicity here. So I think what we'll cover today is I'd like to go through a little bit of what we've done as a team over the last year, because I think it's it's a good example of a lot of the problems that people are facing, especially within Web3, about how do you solve some of these public goods funding problems, and how that actually reveals itself through a set of problems that you see when you try and fund a large-scale network that has a lot of public goods. So we'll talk about a very high-level overview about how do we specify the resource allocation problem for public goods. How Protocol Labs has actually created a network funding team to solve this, what do we do ourselves, and how do we do this for more broadly outside of the Protocol Labs network. And then I just want to give a quick high-level overview about what we've done last year. So I'm going to oversimplify for the sake of trying to make a point here, but really when I think of resource and capital allocation, we're getting a capital source and trying to allocate it towards projects that are generating a positive impact as indicated by the capital source. If the capital source thinks that the impact that is being created is worth the investment, then it will continue to allocate in a regenerative way. So really that's all it boils down to. In an ideal world, capital would be able to find suitable endpoints for product or for productive impact relative to cost. If you look at the diagram here, you can see each of those arrows is an exchange of not only funding, but it's an exchange of information. It's an estimate of positive impact relative to the cost. It's finally also a resource transfer. So what it means is that each of these arrows actually has significant cost associated with it, and ideally, it would be perfectly allocated. However, also, when we think of the projects that are sitting on the other side, these can be public goods, so net positive externalities, but they don't have sufficient value capture to capture all of the value they create, or it can also be projects that are self-sustaining, so they create impact and they also have sufficient individual value capture. However, the distribution of this capital is a really hard problem. So often you aren't actually going to get a large amount of capital and actually be able to allocate it perfectly to all the problems and the projects that you want to create the impact that you need. Projects can be missed. It leads to a decrease in efficiency and a negative impact in some cases. So what can you do? You can introduce distribution methods. Those can be entities, mechanisms, new theories, new valuation methodologies to actually help allocate capital more efficiently and even at a local level. But it can also increase overhead because you're introducing additional steps to the process. Another thing you can do is find fewer, larger investments that are still going to create a positive impact with the capital that you are deploying. So how do you think about this in a very generalized way? There's four things you need to consider in this capital allocation question. It's one, where is the capital coming from and how is it regenerative and how is it continuing to invest into these problems? Two, what are the distribution methods? So some would call these transaction costs, but distribution methods are the structures, the methodologies, everything that you use to pass information and match capital with projects. This can be legal and financial entities. It can be mechanisms. It can be bonds, quadratic voting, whatever you want it to be. And it can also be information gathering metrics or methods like metrics gathered from an ecosystem. It can be valuation methodologies. The impact is something that can be many different things depending on the funder. It can be profit, it can be strategic, it can be a public good, benevolent idea. But it's a useful feedback loop to understand are the things that we are funding and is the capital being deployed in a correct way that is actually achieving the outcomes we need. And then finally, you have projects. You need to have a series of projects that can actually absorb the capital in an efficient way to be able to get the right outcomes here. So over time, we've seen structures emerge to actually solve this allocation problem in various different ways. You end up in this messy situation where a lot of the funding problems that we're trying to solve start looking a lot like governance and a lot like the way that we coordinate more broadly as a society. But I would generalize into maybe three examples. There are some missing here. And each of these looks at a different way of solving this problem of where is my capital source, where are my distribution methods, and how do I think about impact on a few different vectors. So you have governments and corporations that typically they have almost a self-contained value umbrella where through either taxation or revenue capture, they're able to fund all the projects, and they will go through and typically do either internal structures or some amount of internal and external contracting to allocate the capital they have. Typically, this is all done internally. When on the far right side, you see market structures, and market structures have a unique flavor to it where, because they have very robust methodologies of things like valuation. So how do we think about discounted cash flow in the case of like traditional, companies, securities, stocks, et cetera? How do we think of like the development of the P&L, financial ROI? All these things have helped us actually compress this information gathering and passing problem to be able to actually kind of externalize a lot of these steps, and has enabled us to kind of open up a new kind of like market dynamic, because we're able to do so since there is such a robust methodology on the distribution side. However, we see that the impact is actually very, it's oversimplified. It's a financial ROI most of the time, and doesn't take into account strategic impact, positive externalities, the classic failure of the capital markets. What this means is, if you click a layer deeper, is that public goods allocation is often underdeveloped, or it's very centrally planned. So governments are typically taking on a lot of the burden of like funding the public goods within their own sphere of influence. In some cases, you see corporations getting large enough that they are actually taking on this public goods funding process. So, the classic example that we use at Protocol Labs, we would think of something like Bell Labs, which, although it had monopoly power, was able to fund, incredible developments in information theory, the transistor, continue. The one thing I'll note here is that when you look at the amount of development that has happened on each of these kind of distribution methods, when it comes to like the legal structures, the valuation methods, everything that we can do to get capital from A to B, the market structure side of things has far more development than any of these internal processes. And that enables some very interesting dynamics, but also allows it to not need a central governance to be able to actually allocate that capital in a proper way. Now come to today. Web3 networks actually create a very interesting new paradigm where we have these new systems that now have to think through new ways of figuring out how to allocate capital within themselves. You have an interesting scenario where, if you look at the capital source, you're seeing a bunch of different organizations that now have to come together in some ways to fund an ecosystem. And we've seen ways of doing that through things like coalition funding, DAO formation. We've also seen a really interesting and developing field in kind of tokenization. You see ecosystem tokens that are able to tie together capital allocation in a way that wasn't previously done before. It also allows us to kind of capture value in a way that we can uniquely fund network goods and public goods in a way that wasn't done before. Now, I will point out, though, that the distribution methods, particularly for things like public goods and network goods, are very poorly developed. So it takes a lot of effort, and it's a very high lift to be able to do things like identify as a kind of coherent unit across multiple funders what are the key infrastructure goods that we have within our ecosystem that we should be investing in. It falls under a lot of the kind of commons problems that Eleanor Ostrom pointed out. So it's really because we're now seeing this decentralization of the funding entities, but also this additional layer of the ecosystem token value alignment, that we're seeing a need for a rapid development in some of the methodology to understand what is value, what are the intermediate institutions that we need to actually distribute capital from the ecosystem to the projects that are going to invest and grow in the ecosystem itself. How can we identify projects that are actually going to be valuable and scale them up? Because right now we're seeing, a bit of a cliff when it comes to ecosystem funded or kind of coalition funded large scale public goods or network goods problems. So try and point out a $50 million run rate company or project within an ecosystem that is not funded by the central institution within that. So I think another big thing here is the impact. And this comes back to how do we value public goods impact. It's very, very difficult to be able to properly allocate and understand the efficiency of how we're funding these problems if we don't understand how impactful the capital that we are spending is. I'll also point out that there's a very large need for scale public goods investment. It's interesting when you start looking, and there's a few different angles to this. Different types of funding sources are applicable for different sizes of funding, and different types of projects are only enabled at certain funding cliffs. So if you look down the list, you'll see that in some cases, when you get to the top, at the bottom you can crowdfund, you can see individual projects that are able to support these kind of smaller developments. But there are a series or a class of problems that only are solvable when we start looking at orders of magnitude larger funding problems. So when you think of what could we get done with $100 million,
That's only currently fundable really by NGOs, foundations, corporations that exist within the Web 2 world. But that could be like massively, massively impactful for Web 2 once we figure out how to actually get a coalition funding model for up to 100 million, a billion, things like 100 billion plus, which is almost like a supranational level. We'll start seeing some really interesting problems revealing themselves once we get to that scale of funding. And it's also worth noting too that there are a lot of funders that won't actually write checks below $10 million. It's easier for them to write a $50 million check than a $50,000 check. And when we start realizing that, we see that we really need to fill the gap and be able to create these systems so that people can fund at scale and bring that into kind of the public goods ecosystem. So that's where Protocol Labs network funding comes in. And I'm going to try and tie this all together in about 5 minutes here. But really what Protocol Labs network funding is in a nutshell is we are an organization that is trying to create scalable funding systems for public goods and commons, so to tackle all of what we see as the most pressing problems in today's society. So when we think about how do we get there, there's a couple steps. Step one is, since we do have the benefit of being a network with a kind of defined value capture mechanism in our ecosystem, we can build and test these systems with some kind of more naive assumptions using our own ecosystems. Once we have those methodologies developed, we can actually take those, expand to broader public goods in Web3 and beyond. And step three is solar punk future. We all live in kind of like the Jetsons era, but we're not quite there yet. So how do we actually like piece this thing apart? I would kind of split it into 3 different areas. The way that we've organized ourselves is, one, there are a lot of, like we looked at a few pages ago, there's a lot of like unsolved problems or things that need to be drastically improved from an efficiency and effectiveness standpoint when it comes to mechanism research. So we need fundamental research to understand what are the entity structures, what are the valuation methodologies that we need to be able to actually properly allocate money towards public goods. What are the distribution methods that we can improve? There's things like hypercerts, which will be talked about later today, impact evaluators, many other experiments there. And there's, again, legal and financial areas which we've been exploring, which I'll touch on in a second. Also, we just need to operate these funding structures. We need to pilot the existing mechanisms. We need to productize and scale. We have parts of our team that's dedicated to doing that. And the third is we can't do this alone. We need community. We need partnerships. We need to bring everybody in, or else we're not going to be able to do this. So in the same ethos as what we've done with Protocol Labs, open sourcing everything we've done, creating working groups, try to design events like Fun in the Commons to aggregate the community. So we've only been around for about 1 year. What we've done so far is, on the funding side, we've structured over $10 million in funding allocated towards public goods and network goods problems. We've created 2 decentralized investment structures that are allocating capital towards what we view as like the public goods of the Protocol Labs network. We funded over 70 teams and contributors in the last 12 months. We've also pushed forward mechanism research, although we'd like to accelerate that as well. So we have hyper certificates. The V0 standard has been launched. Holka, our colleague, will talk a little bit more about that soon. We've launched multiple funding experiments on impact evaluators, quadratic voting internally, which we'll be doing a better job of releasing going forward. And we've also done a lot of these Fun in the Commons events. So thank you for everybody who has seen those previously. These have been very exciting. So I'll just go into detail about a few specific ones and give you an overview, and there'll be people later on who will actually talk in more detail about all of these for you. So blue funds are an interesting mechanism that we've been developing. Essentially, this is more of a kind of like financial and legal play about how can you create a structure that has a scoped, focused investment thesis and has an area or network of public goods with like very clear success metrics so that you can allocate against it. When you define a closed system here, you can actually allocate a ton of mechanisms and design like incentive structures around it. So you can do a series of, once you've defined the outcomes, you've defined the area, you can identify multiple funders who might be interested in this problem, and you have this like optimized structure to be able to bring them in and actually, action against it. You can design incentives, you can design the funding fields against it. So it's just a really optimized way to bring multiple people in. Right now, we have 2 active funds. We have a private retrieval fund, which is investing in reader private access to IPFS and Filecoin. That's a combination of core fundamental research, where we're actually sponsoring like multiple PhDs and research groups to push forward like fundamental research there, and also implement some of that research. So we're trying to accelerate the field drastically in research. Addie, my colleague, will talk more about that. We're also have launched an IPFS implementations fund, which is meant to accelerate the development of IPFS. Again, combination of research, productization, and scale grants, along with a bit of a budget for experiments like impact evaluators, retroactive funding, different ways we can kind of optimize this. We've also run a ton of impact evaluator experiments. I know we've talked about impact evaluators a lot. I'm not sure if any of you were in Bogota, but we spent a little bit more time there. We've run multiple impact evaluator experiments, both like explicitly and implicitly. The cheeky answer on the left-hand side is Filecoin is an impact evaluator. So I didn't run that. I'm not Juan Benet. I did not create Filecoin. But we did do some other cool experiments ranging from like very kind of quantitatively focused impact evaluators all the way to very subjective like expert opinion impact evaluators, similar to what Optimism has been doing with retro PGF. So we've got a lot of learnings there, and we've been scaling this up pretty rapidly and plan to like really put a dedicated effort into scaling this up alongside the community going forward. We also have actually created this PL network capital funds. So if you look, there's actually, if you're in the Protocol Labs network, there are a series of different funding mechanisms across all levels of ranging from kind of network goods all the way down to research. We also have different kind of like, we want to basically stage it so that there's funding at every kind of like important milestone, similar to what you'd see in VC. So what we've done is with, between ourselves and members of the ecosystem, there are various different funding categories that people can go to actually fund network goods and public goods within our ecosystem. So pretty happy how this has come together. One of the critical things here is that it's the coordination problem among various different entities becomes very tricky, especially if you want to truly decentralize. It's like, how do I know that somebody else isn't already funding this person? How do we ensure that we're like funding this person in the optimal way without overcapitalizing them, things like that. So what we found so far is existing programs have really good coverage on like early stage network goods and PL. I think like people have developed good things like grants, foundations, builders funnels. Those actually are pretty well suited to public goods as well. And it's almost hard to distinguish between kind of an ROI seeking project and a public goods a lot of the time at the beginning, as long as there are people using it. So that's great. It means that we can kind of take advantage of existing systems and focus our efforts on kind of the scale public goods. We've also seen that between point solutions of trying to deploy standalone impact evaluators, standalone grants or mechanisms, those really aren't as effective as combined programs where you see a combination of grants to solve one part of the incentive problem, impact evaluators to provide follow-on incentives and signal at the end, and a series of grants at every single stage. So I think there's a lot of work to be done about pulling together all of the cool stuff that you've seen from Fund the Commons into like more composable projects. I think there's a lot of need for kind of like, dedicated versus one-off funding pools. Right now, I think a lot of things are done on a case-by-case basis where you could really benefit from having a large pool of capital dedicated to specific functions over a long time versus them having to reapply every 6 months for a grant. And finally, there's like a huge amount of open space on tooling. With tooling, we've already seen like drastic reductions in the amount of time it takes to perform kind of like allocation and coordination efforts. And there is so much open space to do better versions of quadratic voting tooling, better impact evaluators, working on top of some of the examples that have been built with hyper certificates. Like there's just a lot of room for tooling to drastically improve the distribution process here. So what's to come? We are looking to massively scale mechanisms. So our focus has been so far on hypercerts, impact evaluators. We are going to look at some new mechanisms going forward. So if you have any ideas, we're all for it. We want to formalize and accelerate blue funds and really start seeing how we can focus those externally and focus on like broader public goods beyond our own network once we've kind of proven that they work in a kind of like idealized situation with Protocol Labs. We also want to kind of like build out multi-funder efforts on large-scale public goods. So how can we get multiple aligned parties together in some of these new structures that we've built to invest on large-scale public goods efforts? And then finally, we want to kind of build a more kind of comprehensive system with like robust validation, tracking, to kind of solve that part of like are we creating impact with a lot of the capital that we're spending? Great. I think I made it with 1 minute to spare, so happy to answer any questions if there are. Do you have a mic? I could probably just yell.
Okay. So I wanted to ask if you guys are thinking about how to incorporate previous experience and from all the public and private sector ways that people have approached these I guess I'll repeat. My question is, how are you guys thinking about incorporating effectively all the previous experience from people that have been doing this kind of public funding work, as well as similar things in the private sector, large corporations, even VCs and so on, and make sure that we're not reinventing the wheel, not falling into the same traps over again?
Yeah, you mean we're not the first person to think of all this? No,
No.
it's yeah, no, we fully understand that, and I think we want to avoid the trap of like Web3 trying to invent everything from the ground up. What that means, I think, is a lot of like collaborations and talking to people within the space. So previous Fund in the Commons, we actually talked to people who were coming from kind of like the traditional, the labor side of like how do we do unions, how do we do kind of like trade organizations that have learned a lot of these coordination problems and have different approaches to the same problem. It just means a lot of like how do we partially bridge the gap between kind of outside of like our Web3 kind of echo chamber to existing people with a lot of, or existing organizations, people with a lot of like historical context. Filecoin Foundation is like within the Protocol Labs network. They do a lot of work with traditional NGOs, and we have a lot of great people that kind of have given us advice about, hey, like you guys are solving a problem that somebody looked at 40 years ago. So it's really like maintaining a little bit of kind of like being humble and understanding that we don't need to reinvent everything. And this, it's the classic, there's no such thing as novel ideas anymore. We're just like rediscovering things that we already knew before. So if there are things that you have seen up there and you think would be good to look up in the past, please let me know. Perfect. Are we doing on time? Are we good? Yeah, sure, fire away. Yeah.
This is sort of half a comment, half a question. But I just thought that Filecoin seemed almost unique. In fact, that a lot of people were kind of worried about maybe a negative externality of Bitcoin in terms of energy consumption, etc. That's been quite famous with proof of work. And the next step, or so it was seen, was to have sort of zero impact. But then Filecoin seems to me to be the first to be a little bit more ambitious and actually have a positive externality, which seems to me to be the way to go. So, I mean, is it, as far as I know, is that related to your interest in funding the Commons, that you can have a sort of positive output as a sort of side effect of the protocol? Are those two things related, or is it just my imagination?
No, I mean, Juan can give you a better answer here, but I think it's like, it's something that is very core to the Protocol Labs ethos and was like built in. I think the way I've heard it described is like Filecoin was built as a way to, how do we create like useful work out of all these like proof of work algorithms, and then there's work on things like Filecoin Green, which is actually trying to offset the carbon impact of the Protocol Labs network and all of our activities. So it is something that's like very clear, and I think I would almost flip it and say that we are trying to create the mechanisms for the public good. The fastest way seems to be to prove it in our own backyard, because we have like a very, very beautifully set up system that allows us to quickly test these like economic mechanisms and then like use that to kind of expand it more broadly. So, yes to your answer. Yeah. Cool. I think I'm over time and getting stared down here. No. All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone. Please like ask me any questions. We'll be around the whole day, and I would be super interested in introducing my next speaker, Carla, if she's up to, oh, she's on the other side. I was looking over here. So Carla is the head of network research. Among many other things that she does, she's been critical to a lot of the initiatives that we've done as well here, and she's got a lot of interesting ideas and work that our team is doing on kind of expanding the future and reimagining how research is done.